Hello and welcome along to the Property Academy podcast by Opes Partners. I'm your host, Stephen Knight.
And I'm Andrew Nicol.
And today on the show, we're talking about how to time the property market right with the property clock. Now, we did an episode about this probably about 100 episodes ago, but I've got a new and improved database
Now, hang on a minute.
property clock to share with everyone.
New and improved. How can it be new and improved?
Well, it's both. It is
Now,
both
how?
new
How?
and improved. Well, if you wait for another 10 minutes, Andrew, you are going to see it.
But I thought you didn't like property clocks.
I don't like property clocks, and that's for multiple reasons. But just before I get in and talk about why I don't like property clocks, even though I just built one for everybody, Andrew, talk to us about what the property clock actually is.
So a property clock is a really commonly used tool that helps people visualize kind of the property market. So you can kind of say, okay, well, we have the cycles of a property market. And so you might have, times where the prices are really good and then times when the prices are really bad and interest rates are high, and it helps you see you go round that cycle.
Yeah, okay. Well, how does that translate into a clock for everybody listening on their treadmill at home? Well, that 12 is fucking hot and 6 is very quiet and 9's recovering and 3's bad.
Okay. So normally you have, 12 being the top of the clock. That's when prices are high and, it's all good. Everyone wants to be in the property market. 6 is really, really bad. Prices are low. Interest rates are high. It's probably arguably where we are right now. 3, kind of somewhere between 6 and 12, that's, flatter market, and 9, you're kind of in recovery.
Yeah, and it's one of the things that I've always hated about the property clock is that if you think about a standard clock, it takes you 6 hours to go from 12 down to 6, and it takes you 6 hours to go from 6 back up to 12. That's not actually how the property market works. We've done episodes in the past talking about that going from 6 to 12, so a kind of boom phase, that can last about 6 years, but it might take you only 4 years to get from 12 back down to 6 and things like that. So it doesn't quite work exactly like a clock, even though, the visual of the property market going down and then the property market coming back up can be quite useful to just remember, oh my gosh, prices are going down, but eventually they are going to recover.
I think one of the things that I also see that I don't like is that sometimes people use it to suggest that the entire market is in a particular part of the property cycle right now. So they might say, oh, New Zealand now has got interest rates coming down. You're going to see the recovery phase kick in, and then we're going to see a boom again. That might be true, but it's probably not going to be the same for every different region.
Yeah, because some regions might stick in a really flat market for 10 years. It's not like the clock keeps on necessarily moving. And so what I wanted to do was create a data-based version of this to try and visualize every region in the country and kind of understand, well, what sort of market are we in? Where have we been? Where are we going? And I actually got this idea probably about 5 years ago from another economist called Cameron Bagri. He used to be the chief economist at the ANZ, and he kind of made his own version of the property clock. And I remember once he said, oh, you should give me a call and, maybe I could sell you the way that I do it. So anyway, I called him up. It was a bit expensive, so I thought, I'll just make my own instead. And so that's classic me.
Yeah.
I'm like, I don't like spending money on things at the best of times. And so, Andrew, what I've got to show you is kind of my version of the property clock. And I want to show you how it works over time. I'll make this a little bit bigger for you. Now, I realize everybody listening to the podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, you won't be able to see this, but I'm going to just explain to you how it works. So if I take you back to kind of 2002, where we start, where are the main regions in their property cycle back in 2002, Andrew?
So New Zealand as a whole, Auckland and Canterbury, are all in the kind of correction phase or correction quadrant of your property clock. And then Wellington kind of is in the early recovery.
Yeah, and so when we talk about correction, we're really talking about somewhere between 3 and 6. So that bottom right quarter of a standard clock. But over time, in late 2002 and 2003, New Zealand went through one of the largest booms it's ever had. And so what's happening with all of those regions, Andrew?
They're all bouncing around the top of the clock, or quadrant in this instance, and you're seeing just obviously a lot of growth in all those regions.
Yeah, and what's fascinating is now we're somewhere between 9 and 12. We're in that top left quadrant. But look how fascinating. If we take you to the start of 2002, we were all in that bottom right hand of the clock, we were between 3 and 6. And within a year, all of a sudden, we've bounced all the way up into the boom phase of the property clock. We're now between 9 and 12. And that's one of the reasons why I hated property clocks, because I'm like, well, we just skipped the early recovery phase. We went straight to boom phase in my model. Now, what's fascinating, though, is that over time, we start to lose momentum. And then in 2008, where do we find ourselves?
Back in the correction phase. We're way down in kind of number, what would that be on the clock? 4, 5.
Yeah, we're around that, somewhere between 3 and 6. And Andrew, what was happening around 2008? Just remind us for any youngins.
That was right in the middle of the GFC.
Yeah, and then if we go ahead, I want to skip forward to about 2016 because it was quite fascinating because we start to see some divergence between the regions. So April 2016, what were we seeing?
You got Wellington, Auckland, and New Zealand in that boom territory, but then you've got Canterbury in the early recovery phase.
And when we say early recovery, we're talking about between 6 and 9. The bottom right-hand side, I just had to check if it's
left, bottom left.
No, bottom left. Oh, bottom left. How's it the bottom left side? So we're starting to see sales pick up, but not necessarily house prices. Now, if we zoom forward to mid kind of 2017, you start to see some more divergence. What are you seeing there?
So now you've got New Zealand, Canterbury, and Auckland kind of around the bottom, kind of at 5 or 6 on the clock. Wellington going through a bit of a boom.
Yeah, and that's when Wellington and a lot of the smaller regions were booming in 2017, and Auckland and Canterbury were mainly flat. Of course, we then had the massive 2021 COVID boom, and then during 2023, we went right back into correction mode. Now, one of the reasons I kind of like this live version of the property clock is it gives you a bit of a sense of where the market is. So 2023, it was particularly bad. Zoom forward to 2024, we're not totally out of the correction, but the worst part of the correction appears to be over. The market has somewhat recovered. And that helps to visualize it in a way that just looking at property prices doesn't always give you that same insight. And so the reason I kind of am falling in love with this version of the clock, even though this is kind of my first version, not forever version, I'll keep working on it, is that you can actually see on one single graph where a couple of the main regions actually are within the market, which is sometimes quite difficult to visualize.
Can you just talk me through how you're measuring where a region is plotted?
Sure. So if I take you back to the kind of original property clock most people know and love, what we kind of think about is as we move out of the slump and into the recovery phase, what we tend to see is the number of sales start to increase, but property prices not necessarily rising yet. That's kind of the theory behind the property clock. And so we should start to see it taking fewer days to sell a property. We should start to see the housing stock come down. We should start to see just more properties transacting, but that not necessarily translating into higher property prices just yet. That's the theory. Then we move into the boom phase and we've got a lot of activity. We've got a lot of sales happening, properties selling very quickly, low numbers of housing stock, properties listed on the market, and high house prices.
And is that compared to long-term average or is it compared to the last 12 months?
So what we're looking at is sales data and price-based data. And we're kind of saying how hot are prices compared to the hottest they've ever been, and how cold are prices compared to the coldest it's ever been. And so, for example, when we look at 2023, property prices were the coldest that they had ever been. And so we see that we're definitely around that 6 o'clock mark. Move back to 2021, property price rises were the hottest they'd ever been, so they're right at the top of the clock. But what I'm doing is taking a whole heap of different data and seeing, is it as hot as it's ever been, or is it as cold as it's ever been, or is it somewhere in the middle, putting it all together and then saying, based on not just one data point, but multiple data points, where are we kind of at? And I think this is what we all normally do anyway. Like if we're analyzing a property market, we don't just look at one data point, we'll look at days to sell, the amount of housing stock, the number of properties being transacted. We might look at how fast property prices are rising across a couple of different measures. We might look at CoreLogic's numbers and Ryan's numbers, and we might look at change in median sale price. You probably wouldn't most of the time, but you might add that in as part of your analysis and kind of look at a range of data points and say, well, where do we think we're at? And this is effectively what I'm trying to replicate.
And so what this is your first version. Have you got plans for your next version?
Oh, I've definitely got plans for it, Andrew. I'm never stopping. One thing that I definitely want to do with this is adjust the seasonality. So at the moment, I'm not adjusting for the fact that, during January, the property markets tends to lurch to a bit of a colder market. You see this all the time across my current property clock. And so there's another example of it happening. So I want to adjust for all of that. But, it took me about 8 hours to throw this together. So I thought, you know what, I'll release it, get some feedback, and then we'll keep improving it. But Andrew, this is the first time I've actually shown you this. And I've gone down a bit of a nerdy hole here. As a property investor, how would you use something like this? So it's all very well to say, oh, this is very cool, Ed. I quite like this. But how would you start to use it?
So I think this is a good way of visualizing exactly where kind of a region is, and probably giving you a bit of confidence. Oh yeah, okay, we've probably got through the hard part of the Auckland property market, for example. And I can see that, historically we get bounced between, correction into recovery into boom. So, okay, now might be a good time for me to start thinking about that area. This is just one of the tools that you'd use to consider, should I be investing there now or somewhere else?
And I suppose one of the other questions that a lot of people might have is, how much can I use this to predict the future of the property market? And what I'd say is, at the moment, this is not predictive, it's more indicative. So it will give you an indication of where the property market is at. It won't necessarily give you a prediction of where it's going to go. Because one other thing, when you actually kind of take the theory of the property clock and try and make a data-based version, you see that actually a lot of the markets don't necessarily move right around the clock in a straightforward manner. You tend to see them lurch between a correction phase and going up into a boom phase. You might start to see phases of early recovery, but it doesn't move directly around like that kind of property clock could or should. So maybe I'll start to try and look at it, but it's probably saying, well, actually, maybe the theory of the property clock isn't quite as correct as we might have always thought. God, we got a bit nerdy there. Sorry, Andrew.
That's okay.
The one thing that I just wanted to point out as well is that this does correlate really, really nicely with property prices. So if I take you back to kind of 2008, we saw the Auckland market flat for quite some time. And so if we look at where we were saying that the Auckland property market was at in 2008, we were saying it was definitely in correction mode in that kind of 3 to 6 o'clock kind of area. By the time we get to around 2013, late 2012, Auckland property prices start to boom. And we can see, if we zip forward to 2012, Auckland starts to move up into that boom phase way before any of the other parts and regions. And so Wellington was primarily still down in that correction phase while Auckland was booming in mid-2013, and that is exactly what we started to see. And so that's why I kind of say it gives you quite a nice indication of where a market is compared to other regions, which is quite difficult to see. But we'll make this available for you guys on our website. If producer Dave reminds me, I'll make sure our website team gets it on there, and we'll link it down in the show notes so you can see it as well. Or it'll just be on opespartners.co.nz/learn. Right, let's wrap it up there, but please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Really does help us get the message out to more people. And if you want to play around with this property clock, as I said, it's on opespartners.co.nz. If you are listening to this and you want to see the property clock in action, you might like to check out our YouTube channel, Opes Partners YouTube. Just Google that. It'll be the first thing that comes up. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure you hit the subscribe button. We release new videos on here every Monday and Wednesday. Thanks for listening to the Property Academy podcast. I'm your host, Steve McKnight.
And I'm Andrew Nicol.
We're going to be back again tomorrow with even more daily strategies, tactics, and insights to help you get the most out of the property market. Until next time.